Good afternoon, and welcome, everybody. My name is Jimena Valdez-Sessler, and I'm the chair of the Temple Museum Committee. On behalf of all committee members, and on behalf of our interim museum director, Debbie Friedman, and our recently retired museum director, Sue Koletsky, I welcome everybody to the 9th program associated with our Warhol exhibition. 2 more programs are coming. On May 7th, the program on Albert Einstein, which will be led by Rabbi Cohen, and on June 11th, the program on Gertrude Stein, which will be led by Jane Rothstein. So at the end of Rabbi Dadoun's presentation, for the question and comments portion of the program today, please raise your hand. I will greet you with the microphone so that you can use it, and those that are viewing this program online remotely can hear your question. So let me just say a few words about Rabbi Dadoun. She has been at our congregation since July of 2020. And despite the fact that she arrived in the midst of COVID pandemic, she very rapidly became a favorite of everybody with her popular programs for families and youth, and her positive energy. Rabbi Dadoun is of Moroccan, Tunisian heritage, and she has introduced a number of cultural programs at the temple that have become very popular, that sort of celebrate diversity in food and culture. Prior to her religious training and her rabbinical degree, she also obtained a degree in political science and in theater. And for several years before joining us, she also performed as the cantorial soloist at several congregations, which explains why we delight with her voice, harmonizing with Cantor Sibo at our services. She has many talents, and I'm sure she will educate us and give us a lot of insight into Golda Meir. Golda Meir, the only woman in the room. Welcome, Rabbi Dadoun.
Thank you, everyone. It is my honor to be here today, especially in this moment when it's snowing at the end of April. Thank you all for joining us. This Warhol program has been really inspiring, and what a wonderful way to bring our community together through art, through culture, and learning about important Jews and how they affected our present day. I am so delighted to be speaking about Golda Meir for so many reasons. I will say that the one book that really kind of shaped my presentation today is called The Only Woman in the Room by Pnina Lahav. It was translated from Hebrew, and it offers the story of Golda Meir through the perspective, and there are many, but through the perspective of her womanhood and being a woman. And the kind of ironic part of this is that she was often called the only man in the room. But really, of course, a woman. I will invite you to ask any and all questions at the end of the presentation. I really did my best to keep this less than 4 hours. I failed, I'm just kidding. But there's a lot that's not in here. There's so much that's not in here, and maybe we'll get to talk about it at the end. Agreed? Agreed, okay. So there are, as I mentioned, so many ways to think about Golda's legacy. She was a pioneer, a trailblazer, and dedicated to anything she was passionate about. She loved her family dearly, but prioritized her love of politics. She was soft-hearted when she was moved, harsh when she needed to be, and played the role of the traditional woman when it served the greater good. She was tactful, strategic, and often unaffected by truly cruel criticism. When telling her story, one could share it from a political perspective, from all of her work in America, the Zionist movement, and the State of Israel. One could also approach her life from a feminist perspective, examining her role and the choices, knowing that her womanhood could not be separated from who she was, coupled with the deeply rooted nuances that existed in the mid-20th century around women's responsibilities. So today, I'm actually going to try to do a little bit of each. It is truly impossible to separate the fact that Golda was a woman in politics at a time where women struggled to be heard, let alone in politics. Moreover, it was a time when her womanhood often played against her, starting from a young age, and we really have to appreciate where she came from and her upbringing in order to truly comprehend how much of a pioneer she truly was. Born in Tsarist Russia, Golda Meir was born in 1898 in Kyiv, which was then part of the Russian Empire. Her parents, Bluma and Moshe Yitzchak, treated her as a particularly precious daughter. Bluma and Moshe Yitzchak lost several children. Child mortality at that time was high, and there were 9 years between she and her older sister, Shana, and sadly, they had lost 5 children in between to various illnesses. Golda's father was mostly an unemployed carpenter, leaving much of the heavy lifting to their mother, who owned a Pinsk pub where she was able to provide the family with a myriad of odd jobs. It also didn't help at this time that pogroms were rampant and a normal part of Jewish life, normal. Jewish neighborhoods, shops, homes were often violently attacked, damaged, and looted, accompanied by rape and murder. The most famous pogrom in the town of Kishinev in 1905 solidified the notion that the world was unsafe for Jews and gave fundamental justification for the Zionist movement. Simultaneously, the family's financials worsened, and while Golda had a great interest in reading and teaching herself Hebrew from a Jewish prayer book, schooling was not a priority for women at that time, and Golda was required to help in the home and at the pub. The Mabovich family understood they needed to flee Kyiv quickly and sent Moshe Yitzchak, Golda's father, to the United States ahead of the family to help with the financial strain. When Bluma and her daughters were ready to reunite with their father, they were surprised by additional challenges. Bluma, Golda's mother, learned that by law, only men were able to hold a passport, and women were required to travel under their husband's documents. To make matters worse, Golda's father had previously registered another woman and her children in his passport to make extra money, which made it impossible for Bluma and the girls to travel under their official identity. The instability in Golda's life, unable to attend school, and other difficult restrictions in her life would damage her confidence and affect her outlook of the world. Golda, Bluma, and Shana were finally able to leave right after the Passover Seder and arrived in Milwaukee in 1906. Golda and her sister Shana took to their American life pretty quickly. From a very early age, she had an independent mind and learned how to negotiate, in particular with men. In school as a young girl, she earned good grades and acquired more and more of her American identity there. Her entire family at this time was figuring out different ways to Americanize themselves and took on English names. Her father, Moshe Yitzchak, became Morris. Bluma became Bella. Shana became Jenny. And her little sister went from Tzipka to Clara. But Golda remained close to her name and became Goldie, though she never wanted to distance herself from her name, but understood that she had to fit in to her new society, and that was a compromise, to shift to Goldie. And she would later Hebraize it when she gets to Israel and called herself Golda. Golda did not win every dispute at home. When she wanted to continue her schooling as a young adult, her parents were more concerned about marriage and finding stability, as they had always known. Bella and Morris were more concerned about the disgrace the family would have rather than Golda's happiness. The fights grew more and more unbearable, and Golda followed in her sister's footsteps and ran away from home as well, and went to live with Jenny in Denver, Colorado. Her getaway was planned like a meticulous military campaign, including her accomplice, her best friend, Regina Hamburger. That is her real name. Branching out on her own in Denver, Colorado, it is where Golda discovered politics and her thirst for policy and legislation. Upon arrival to Denver, Colorado, Golda enrolled in high school and worked at a dry cleaning shop to keep herself afloat. She ironed clothes, did her homework in her downtime. And in the evenings, Golda and Jenny held proletariat salon meetings that composed of Russian and Jewish immigrants, all bright and self-taught, aspiring intellectuals. Golda was energetic, diligent, and never complained. She maybe for the first time felt a true sense of purpose and excitement. Here she was introduced to high-level, vibrant intellectual discussions. Among them were ideas around anarchist philosophy of Emma Goldman and Peter Kropotkin, President Wilson in the European situation, pacifism, the role of women in society, and the future of the Jewish people. She kept mostly quiet at these meetings, absorbing everything she could. And at one of these gatherings, she met another less talkative guest named Morris Meyerson. This young immigrant from Lithuania was 5 years her senior. They had a lot in common, not just in sharing the same first name as her father, but also their love for art, music, poetry, and reading. In his company, Golda felt the enormous validation and warmth she so craved. She was hungrily seeking affirmations about her intelligence and her looks, for which Morris surely gave. And shortly after meeting Morris, Golda's father begged her to come back home. Golda was enticed by the idea of returning home with all of her newfound political experience, mostly because it wasn't too hard to convince Golda to return to her parents, as her father had just joined the Po'alei Zion, the Workers of Zion, a tiny at the time left-leaning party with Russian roots, whose goal was to help gather the exiles in Palestine, the biblical Eretz Israel, to form a sovereign nation. Another cardinal precept of the Po'alei Zion was socialism, aimed to help improve the overall Jewish welfare. Golda joined her father, and her work with the Po'alei Zion forever informed and solidified her lifelong commitment to politics and to Zionism. And while you had to be 18 years old to be an official member, which she was not yet, she was still able to listen and began to experience the power of persuasive skills in the company of adult men. As time passed, Morris and Golda eventually got married, and at this time, she was able to join the Po'alei Zion as a full member, where she tirelessly attended meetings, raised funds, and traveled near and far. Morris was often unemployed, and this arrangement was highly unusual for this time, a woman in politics traveling around the country while the man stayed home unemployed. In one of her most famous interviews with Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci decades later, she said that domestic bliss wasn't enough for me. I had to be doing what I was doing. She very quickly grew accustomed to being the only woman in the room, where she honed her interpersonal skills, learning how to succeed in the company of men, where she would play nice, avoid confrontation, seek accommodation, take care not to offend the male ego, and of course, be helpful. It was also around this time that she took up the habit of smoking, further signaling a departure from the traditional feminine stereotype. In the next few years of her life, Golda demonstrated her strength and her ability to learn things quickly. She was part of difficult conversations among the Zionist leaders, where conflicting ideas came to play, like which language to speak in these meetings, Yiddish or Hebrew. Golda more naturally leaned towards Yiddish as it was her mother tongue, but also because she wasn't able to be fully educated Jewishly, as she was never able to properly develop her Hebrew. Golda grew more and more passionate for the socialist Zionist cause and would stave off individuals who spoke ill of socialism. She was once invited to speak outside of the synagogue in Milwaukee, because women were not allowed to speak inside of the synagogue, to talk about socialism and the Jewish plight. As an American advocate for the Zionist cause, issues of feminism and the question of the suffragettes began to surface and would follow her entire career. There is much evidence that supports the conclusion that Golda favored women's suffrage. However, as a member of the Jewish immigrant working class, she was often conflicted. Her immigrant community respected the traditional gender-based divisions of labor, and the suffragette movement was mostly dominated by middle-class Protestant women who were people that often opposed immigration and believed that immigrants should not be eligible to vote. And there was often much tension between the suffragettes and the immigrant movements in general. And it was finally in 1921 that Golda recognized the deep similarities on the American frontier immigrant experience and that of labor Zionism. And with this recognition, she leapt and moved to then Palestine with her best friend Regina, her sister Jenny, and Jenny's husbands Shammai, or Sam, and her husband Morris would eventually follow them as well. Her first arrival to Palestine was shaky. There wasn't Google for her to do a little bit of research ahead of time in the way that we do today. So she didn't know exactly what she was walking into. She was immediately thrown into the Jewish Palestinian culture of the new Jew, one that is not feeble or weak. The new Jews were seen as chalutzim, pioneers. They moved to Palestine to toil the land, to defend themselves and rebuild the Jewish home where they were exiled from so many times throughout history. Golda wanted to share in the same experience, and upon arrival to Palestine, applied to join Kibbutz Merchavia. And she and Morris were rejected because a majority of the members suspected they wouldn't be able to handle too much of the physical labor. Golda was unwilling to accept this rejection and persisted until they were finally accepted. And kibbutz life was physically laborious, long hours, and put a strain on her marriage with Morris. Golda was dedicated to the kibbutz, while Morris less so. He found the difference in lifestyle challenging, while Golda thrived. This was the moment their differences really came to light. Golda worked day and night on the kibbutz. When she wasn't outside in the hot sun, working the land, picking almonds, planting trees, and raising chickens, she was thinking about strategic ways to help their kibbutz grow and become more profitable. She was eventually placed to work in the kitchen, which initially was a source of frustration, as this was a typical job for a woman. But as to not stir too much trouble, she embraced the job and made it her own. In true Golda form, she introduced new amenities, raised the standard of food as to better help nourish the laborers who were working outside, providing healthier, tastier foods, and created a more lavish meal for Shabbat, including white tablecloths and flowers to set the day apart. Golda was not particularly religious, but understood that developing the Jewish state meant including Jewish rituals that would embrace their experience and live out the values they had dreamt of. And all of her hard work and innovations paid off. Shortly thereafter, she was elected to serve as a representative of the Histadrut, the General Federation of Labor. And the minutes from the meetings of the Histadrut proved that Golda was a policymaker. One of her most influential and important policies that supported women to become trained in various fields of specialized work. The policy would also provide collective childcare for all the women living on the kibbutz. And while this was not a particularly popular innovation initially, the kibbutz accepted the idea as it takes a village to raise a family. Having recognized her immense talent in policymaking at the kibbutz, the comrades, the leadership of the kibbutz, those who initially rejected her application, now asked her to serve as the delegate to the Second General Socialist Convention. This convention created the building blocks of socialism in Palestine, including the Federation of Labor and Workers Corporation for the state that was gaining steam every day. This moment was the beginning of her professional journey. This was when Golda would learn how to balance her entire self as an American, Russian, Palestinian woman in Israeli society. And at her first convention, she gave a speech in Yiddish, which was seen as sending a mixed message. It was a brave commitment to herself and also impressed some of the old guard, but it had the opposite effect also on some of the founders of Israel, in that it wasn't in Hebrew. In this speech, she did not include or raise awareness regarding gender roles, and this void aggravated women who were trying to break stereotypes at this time and create a place for themselves in society. Golda, in this moment, and many thereafter, committed to walking a middle line, being very, very careful not to take any strong stances, and she was forever criticized for this. And it was also at this time that kibbutz life actually became unbearable for her husband, Morris. And albeit her love for her work at the kibbutz, she decided to put her personal desires aside and to move into the city, to Tel Aviv, and shortly thereafter to Jerusalem. Golda and Morris's marriage was not a fairy tale. They struggled to find common interests and had different priorities in their lives. Golda was eager to penetrate the life of politics in pre-state Israel and did every job that was assigned to her. And it didn't help that Morris had contracted malaria and unfortunately sank into a very deep depression. Golda's curiosity and thirst for politics made her emotionally available to learn from men that had been in the business long before her. And one such individual was David Remez, a powerhouse, one of the handful of men who constructed the hegemony of the labor movement in Palestine and facilitated the establishment of the state. While he was 12 years her senior, Golda was struck by his experience and his openness to help her learn. He was brilliant, analytical, and rational, and embodied the ideals to which she was attracted. Remez was one of several men that Golda was in intimate personal relationship with throughout her career. And these relationships represented the stymied and controlled upbringing she had always felt. The more her parents had attempted to keep her caged, the more rebellious she would become in adulthood. She perhaps for the first time ever felt that she not only had a voice, but that it mattered and that it made a difference. She had strong ideals, but always took that middle path, even when others, especially feminist groups, became upset with her neutrality. Perhaps it was because she was afraid of losing this new gained voice, or maybe she saw that creating systematic change came with knowing before whom you are speaking to that demographic, which at that time was older, white, Eastern European men. The world of politics, which contended a certain openness to both gendered, was actually very, very, very much dominated by Eastern European men. And Golda recognized that and did her best to play within the rules of the system that existed, knowing they wouldn't be open to change if they felt attacked. They were not affected by the women's plight and thus could not begin to understand feminists who were less willing to play by the rules that existed. Golda knew that the male comrades were not ready for fundamental change in gender roles, as this would require a deep reconstruction of masculinity and a commitment to sharing tasks that they perceived as strictly female. And Golda was not trying to be a feminist. She was a politician seeking to make policy, and she also happened to be a woman. Golda's bigger picture mentality made her stand out among the politicians. Whenever she was asked to perform what was customarily seen as a woman's role, she took on the job with a smile and made the most of it, adding her special talent to whatever she could. Her dream was to breathe life into the Jewish state, where Jews could return and live free of persecution. One of Golda's many jobs as a young politician was to raise money for the Histadrut, for the pioneering women of the labor movement. She had unexpectedly raised so much money that the men's chapter asked the women to share some of their funds, and Golda cordially complied. She had used her previous connections in America to secure a more international commitment, and she saw this as a win for the entire Histadrut, not just for the women. Her work in the labor movement, and not just raising funds, turned her into a star. She implemented policies in places that helped laborers create a safe work environment, work reasonable hours, created opportunities for women to enter the workforce, and so much more. And many of these policies that were put in place actually still thrive in Israel today. Her rise to the top of the labor movement put her in close proximity to David Ben-Gurion, who she would personally serve under in the coming years. She worked on specialty projects beyond those of the labor movement. The years leading up to and throughout World War II, Golda would act as foreign secretary, though her love and passion were in the labor movement, but she agreed to help in this role. And one of her most famous clandestine international visits was one to King Abdullah of Jordan. The king would annex parts of Palestine in exchange for letting the Zionists keep the territory assigned to them under the UN Resolution 181. Golda and her security escort and translator, Ezra Danin, crossed the border in disguised appearances, dressed in a suit and a kulfak, which is a hat worn by the members of the Ottoman police, and Golda beside him posing as his wife. Golda was there to meet the King of Jordan and wasted no time in doing so. She boldly stated, "You reneged on your promise to honor the partition resolution." King Abdullah's response was to take all of Palestine and in return honor Jewish subjects by giving them representatives in parliament and recognize their civil rights. This, of course, was not acceptable to Golda or the Zionist movement. And she had heard these promises before. And so to that she responded We have not waited 2,000 years to implement such a plan. King Abdullah eventually assured her that he would keep his initial promise because she was a woman. And many people judged her when she came back, saying that her mission was a failed one because she missed an opportunity to create a bond between the two countries. The king was not accustomed to negotiate with a woman, let alone a forceful one, and perhaps felt alienated. However, Golda saw herself as respectful, wanted to get the job done. She did not want the fact that she was a woman get in the way of her work. That was much more of a focal point for everyone around her, but not for her. She was a politician first. Golda and her security guard, Danin, returned back to Israel surreptitiously in the middle of the night. They were both in dangerous territory, but that didn't scare Golda. And as the sun rose at dawn, the driver that took them back to the Jewish territory recognized the area and refused to drive any farther. So Golda and her guard journeyed back on foot in her long traditional dress, which without a doubt restricted her movement and would have prevented an escape if necessary. And she's later recalled saying that the entire walk back, she could not shake off the depression she felt and sense of failure. The coming years were significant. In 1948, the State of Israel was established, and Golda immersed in the Israeli Knesset. She began her long-tenured political career as being one of 2 women of the 37 members who were the signatories of Israel's Declaration of Independence. In 1948, she was sent to be Israel's first emissary to the Soviet Union, where she had spent 7 very difficult months in Moscow. There, she served both as politician and the mother of the group, as she created affordable meals to conserve the funds for the newly founded State of Israel. She spent many evenings cooking, serving both as politician and housewife for the mission. She observed that in the Soviet Union in particular, women were second-class citizens, so she put her metaphorical professional hat and served as both male and female figure in order to get the job done. Her ego was set aside, and there was no room or time to let her personal feelings interfere with the greater good, which was securing a strong Jewish state. Golda was there to help Soviet Jewry, and she was so successful and represented the new Hebrew Jew so potently that it was broadcast all over Russia and Israel. And she offered real hope and security to Soviet Jews, so much so that Stalin's government accelerated its suppression of Jewish activity, including Yiddish newspapers, Yiddish theater, and other ethnic institutions designed to promote Soviet Jewish culture. Golda's political roles in the Knesset, including her 2 major positions of labor minister and foreign minister between the years of 1947 and 1966, helped to raise her to her most famous role of prime minister. In addition to serving as the leader of the newly founded State of Israel, Golda represented 50% of the world's population, not just Israel's, just by virtue of being a woman. The entire world had eyes on her, and every one of her actions, right, wrong, complex, different, were meticulously analyzed and criticized. She walked a delicate line in her personal and professional life, straddling an almost completely male-dominated field, while also grappling with society's understanding of gender roles. And this is important to note for several reasons. Israel was the first Western country to elect for itself a prime minister who was a woman. And it's important to make the distinction that while a female prime minister was elected in Israel, gender roles in general in the entire country were still very traditional, and in the rest of the world. This means that on the one hand, she was quite aware that sexism was ubiquitous throughout the country, no matter what political affiliation, young, old, poor, wealthy, and that Israeli society, like most countries, treated the patriarchal hierarchy as part of the natural order. On the other hand, Golda was familiar with those pockets of Israeli society that sought to break down the existing gender hierarchy and endorse such efforts. But as a politician, she knew that she had to be careful not to alienate traditionalists. If she lost their support, her political agenda would be doomed. This meant that she often treated women's issues as a secondary part of her agenda. And for example, many times, the issues around women's equality were attached to those of the Mizrahi plight, those Jews that emigrated to Israel from Middle Eastern countries, and other minority issues. Golda's approach was a bit different. She had always hoped that the more women would join the workforce, the more recognition of autonomy and equality they would eventually possess. She did her best to enact laws that would protect mothers who wished to join the workforce. However, women were still expected to participate in traditional institution of family. And while she did not lead a traditional family life, she nevertheless retained a soft spot for the idea. And one of the most impactful moments in Golda's career, which is still debated today, was on October 6th, 1973, Yom Kippur. Arab states surrounding Israel coordinated a surprise attack from all sides on Israel's holiest day when most Jews were at the synagogue. The war officially ended 18 days later after a ceasefire was declared, but the implications of the war lasted for months thereafter. Reservists were called from all over the country to serve up to 6 to 8 months thereafter, including my father, who left my mother alone for about 6.5 months with my, at the time, 1-year-old sister. People criticized Golda, claiming that she didn't take the warnings about this attack seriously enough. But there was so much complexity about that criticism. For one, Golda did not claim to be a general. Quite the contrary, she heavily relied on her generals to steer her in the right direction and relied on their experience when they told her not to preemptively strike. And secondly, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon told Golda that she could not attack Egypt preemptively as she had wanted to perhaps do. And somehow in the end, Israel miraculously won the war, but lost many, many casualties. There are countless other policies, laws, and national impacts Golda had on Israel, the Jewish people, and the world. She ruled from her heart and her gut, and was almost always the only woman in the room. She has become an icon in Israel and in history books across the world. Her face was on Israeli currency. She's written a memoir, has had countless books and films about her, has several plays about her life, and so much more. She's been studied, drawn, written about, and will forever be remembered as the trailblazer in the world. I thank you for listening, and I am excited to start a conversation together.
Rabbi, do you have any indication that Golda Meir ever met Abihail Silver?
Oh boy. Before I make up an answer, does anybody actually know the answer to that? I don't know, though I wouldn't be surprised. She spent a lot of time on the East Coast, but it was mostly in Washington and New York during her political career. Other than that, she was mostly in Wisconsin as a young person, which, there was no reason she would have met Abihail Silver.
Well, I was just wondering at the start of the state of Israel, because of his position, whether you ever...
It is altogether possible. I wish if photography was as,
The archive would probably have that. going to say the archives at Western Reserve Historical would
Maybe.
probably have that. So I have a question.
Yeah.
We're talking about the Yom Kippur War, because I know she took full responsibility, and she even made a statement that was in Lioness, where she says, I wasn't the same person anymore that I was. So my question to you is, because she was so criticized, with all the passage of time, has her reputation been restored?
I think it depends who you ask, like anything. The thing with the Yom Kippur War was it presented real complexity. It was a very complicated and difficult time, and it really wasn't just about Israel and the neighboring Arab countries. It was a time where the Soviet Union had really taken over that area and were feeding weapons into the Middle East, and the Americans were trying to, so this was really an international war, and Israel, I don't want to say got stuck in the middle, that's not exactly right, but it fed into a global issue. So there was warnings that they were going to attack on Yom Kippur. There was warnings they were going to attack. They didn't know it was going to be on Yom Kippur, and no one in Israeli society saw that coming. It was really a surprise. She had preemptively called a third of the reservists out to stand guard, just in case. She wanted to call more reservists, but it was actually her generals that told her not to, because it would be too much money, and it would be too expensive, too costly, and they weren't sure it was going to be necessary. So they ended up only calling a third of the reservists, and turns out it was on it was on the most difficult time to attack Israelis, which is why so many lives were lost for Yom Kippur War.
Rabbi, given the role of gender in Israel, when did the Israelis start drafting women into the IDF and Palmach? Was it during, well, I'm sure it was during Golda's time, but does she have any relationship to that?
Yeah, so she did. She wanted women to be in every part of Israeli society, and of course, including the army. But it was she was very afraid of being pigeonholed, being that she was a woman, to always be the one to push the women's agenda, which is why she was so careful with it. And it was always very nuanced, right? So she would always say, when women serve in this position or the army, it's actually a benefit to the men as well, because they don't have to take on everything by themselves. She tried to really frame it more, these kind of bigger ideas, to get more buy-in. But there was no question that women had been, if you saw the pictures of the new Jew in the middle of the 20th century, to get people to make Aliyah, they had to sell this really incredible idea of the Jew as no longer being the victim, right? The pogroms, it had really destroyed this Jewish notion of strength. And so this idea of the new Jew, the pioneer that was moving to Israel, sold a kind of a mixed picture, right? On the one hand, you see these very strong, 6-foot, big Jewish hunks carrying a hoe, and the women side by side carrying these big buckets, and you're like, oh wow, it was very inspiring, which is why so many people came to be part of the chalutzim and the pioneers. But on the ground, it wasn't exactly like that. There was still a division of gender, and it did affect a lot of women. And so with Golda, I think she tried to, level the playing field, but not in a way that was so obvious, which is, even till this day, I think she gets a lot of criticism for it.
Rabbi, do you know anything about Golda's response to the Munich massacres? I mean, there were rumors and a book and a movie, but I just wonder if you had any actual knowledge about her response.
What do you mean, her response?
Well, the rumors and the book and the movie imply, or even more than imply, show that she kind of organized an effort to go after the Palestinians after the Munich massacres. But I've never really seen that factually anywhere. It's a fascinating book to read. It was a great movie to watch. I just wondered if you had any knowledge.
I don't have more knowledge than probably what you read. You know, I can tell you that she was very empathetic to Jews getting harmed in general, and was often seen crying, which was unusual when she encountered Jewish victims, whether it was at a war. She did a lot of work in Africa with you know, young people, and she was really very empathetic. So I can't say that I've seen documentation from what you're talking about, but I have no reason to believe it's not true.
Being an American and from Russia, she didn't understand the Jews that came from Arab countries.
She
And
did or didn't?
Did not.
Did not.
And when they came to complain and they were talking with her, it was like they were speaking Chinese and she's speaking American. She didn't understand anything that applied from the Jews. That were quite a bit of them that came from Muslim country. And on Yom Kippur War, it was, she hesitated because of the general, what they told her. She knew that Yom Kippur War will come because of the green of the, is the son-in-law of Nasser that told
Angel,
them,
he was nicknamed.
told them that
Yeah.
it's coming. But the general did not believe it. And she said that she had to listen to them. But her problem in Israel was that she didn't understand half of the Israelis that came from the Muslim country.
Yeah, I mean, in all fairness, neither did any of the other Eastern European leaders, right? You know, Mizrahi Jews from Morocco, Tunisia, Iraq, Iran, wherever they came from and made Aliyah to Israel, they were pushed to the periphery. Nobody, you know, it wasn't Golda in particular who didn't understand their plight, though that's true. It was David Ben-Gurion, it was all of them, and it was only after Menachem Begin was elected prime minister was there a little bit of a shift in culture where there was a Mizrahi leader, but, you know, which is so interesting because today, young Mizrahi Jews are kind of reclaiming their Mizrahiness and are coming and really taking their culture and kind of bringing it to light and walking away from kind of an Ashkenormative, what we call an Ashkenormative world, right? Where Ashkenazi is the kind of the dominant face of world Jewry. So you're right. She coupled all of the issues that were challenging for her kind of in one, you know, in one place. But I don't think she wasn't the only one. This was very much the story of all of the aliyot of Israelis that came. Yeah.
I'll never forget when it was Sadat of Egypt came to Israel to meet her, and she said to him, "What took you so long?"
Yeah. She also told him, "You treated me like an old woman."
When and where and why did she die?
She was ill for a very long time. She had some cancers. She is recorded to have been a very heavy smoker. So she was unwell for better part of a decade, if not longer. And eventually, even when she was still in politics and serving in politics, she wasn't doing well and pushed herself. And eventually she passed, you know, in loving and embracing arms with her children, who she was actually very close to. But she was sick.
I have a little amusing anecdote to share about Golda and Cleveland. Probably some 40 years ago, she came to Cleveland to speak, and she was to speak at the Hebrew Academy. Hebrew Academy, an Orthodox Jewish day school, men and women are separated. So they had, and she was of course, the featured speaker. So what do you do? So this was if they would have an event at Hebrew Academy, the Gedolim, the big shots, would be on the stage, on the bima, and everybody else would be in the audience. So this is what they decided to do was to have two circles, two rows of chairs. In other words, a riser, a top row, and a bottom row. On the bottom row were all the men. On the top row, all by herself, was Golda Meir. And it was a very funny image. And of course, it was in the front page of the Jewish News.
Yeah.
This poor woman solo, nobody to talk to, and there was a whole dinner and everything. And then she spoke, so anyway.
I want to say
whatever.
she was used to it.
Rabbi, do you know how things ended up for her and her husband? Did they stay married? Did they divorce? Did she ever
They were
remarry?
kind of separated. They were separated. She had several lovers. That's a good word. Lovers that were, driven, political, strong men. She talks about it pretty openly, actually.
Thank you. Since she couldn't use her father's papers to get out of Russia, how did they get out?
It's unclear. I'm not exactly sure, but they had to travel to several countries before they actually made it to the United States.
One comment is that I just remembered we had that fabulous photo in our exhibition of Dan Levin's photos from the UN archives that shows Abba Hillel Silver in one row, Golda right behind him.
There you go.
I mean, it's a great photo. We were going to make copies. Anything in the book about her children?
Yeah, there's a lot about her children. She was really, she was very close with her children. Even into adulthood, they understood her passion. They never held it against her. They lived close by always. They lived in Israel. Everything is close. She made a priority to be with her children, interestingly enough. Suffice it to say she wasn't doing bedtimes every night, but she made it to important events, and they never resented her for it. Actually, at the end of her life, when she was dying, her children were tried to bring in doctors from everywhere to try to give her a few more days, a few more hours, and the doctors were saying, "Listen, we can only keep her comfortable at this point. That's all we can do." And they, insisted on trying to bring her original, right? There was, so they loved her. They cared about her deeply, and they understood her passion. There was a lot of focus on, Rabbi Klein, I want to hear your question first.
So I'm just wondering a little bit about her famous or infamous comment about there are no Palestinians. On the one hand, she knew of and experienced a variety of senses of alienation, coming to America as an immigrant, having to leave her home, as a woman in a male society. So it would strike me that her sensibility would recognize the issue of feeling marginal. On the other hand, she made this very, very severe statement. So I'm just wondering, I don't know whether there's an answer to this, but whether or not she felt some ambivalence about this comment that she made, recognizing that the Palestinians experienced what she throughout her life experienced. And I wonder if there wasn't some conflict in her between her political ideology and requirements and something about her heart.
I thought we were friends.
After today.
During my interview, when I sat one-on-one with Rabbi Klein, he asked me about Israel. And I was sweating from like my knees, my palms, my elbows, places that don't sweat. And he says, so you think everybody should make aliyah? And I was like, no, so do you love Israel? I'm like, I don't know what you want me to say. I don't know what I'm supposed to say. Look, she answers that question as far as I'm concerned. She says, this goes to her not harshness, she's called harsh, but she was a bottom line kind of a person. And she said, there was the partition plan, they rejected it. They had this opportunity, they rejected it. We wanted to build the country together, they didn't want it. As far as she was concerned, they were done. This notion of Palestinian and not having an identity, I think it's a complicated one. That I don't think it was her lack of empathy. I think it was her drive to get something done. That's how I see it. And interestingly enough, that you talk about her upbringing having to do with empathy, sounds like you didn't say empathy, but that's kind of what I heard. It feels to me that because she had such a difficult upbringing, similarly to Pharaoh, she hardened. I think she just became more rigid and lost a sense of flexibility with time because she was not impatient, but she was ready to get things done. When you hear her speak, she doesn't mix words. She says what she needs to say. She doesn't embellish anything. And she was criticized for it, and I can understand why. But there's also something very honest. Do I think that was the right way to proceed? I don't know. I am not a woman that was raised in the mid-20th century at this time, trying to make it in a man's world in the same way. So it's hard for me to say, but I think that she was so driven with the mission of creating a safe Jewish state that she was willing to do anything. Right, wrong, I don't know. Oh, you're gonna fight with me. What is happening right now?
Because we are friends.
Oh, all right, let's have it.
Your response was what I was driving at. I think you really hit it. There was a kind of harshness because she was driven, and maybe that created in her a bit of lack of empathy. After all, a woman in a man's world and so on. So I think your response kind of gets to something about her character.
Now the question is, would she have been called harsh if she were a man?
Well, I don't know. I
don't know either.
I think so, because that statement, there are no Palestinians, and one can see the political implications and ramifications. But
sure. We're also looking at it through the 2023 lens. Nobody could ever say that today.
That's right.
Right?
That's
and nobody,
true.
I think, would say that. Well, hell no, whatever. The point is, in 1940, 50, 60, when she was saying these things, it was a very different time. Israel was different and much more difficult and complicated, and went through a series of wars with its neighbors. And they didn't know what to do with the Arabs that were living there.
So you understand her comment.
I think it's nuanced and complicated, and I don't judge it in a vacuum. If we're not looking at the whole picture, if we're just looking at her words, I don't think that's fair.
Now you've got me sweating.
Good. Finally. What's a woman got to do around here? Jeez. You see that? God. Cantor, help me out here. I don't know. Start singing, Cantor.
Rabbi,
Yes, Maida.
the word harsh is probably fine for certain situations, but I have sort of a funny family story that deals with Golda Meir. My father met her. He was head of community relation at Federation. He was the head of Federation at the time. And I'm not sure what city he met Golda in, but he met her at the time she came to the United States. So it was maybe 48 or 49 when she came to beg for money for Israel. My father, without discussing it with my mother,
Oh, boy.
gave away 1/2 of his salary for the year to Golda Meir. I found a letter that my mother had written to my father after that in my father's papers after he was gone. But she obviously had the ability to reach and to talk with heart and soul about the need of the Jewish people to survive. And that's what she was all about.
Amen.
Well, Rabbi Dadoun, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for this
Thank you
wonderful
all.
presentation.